Newton was a secretive alchemist with a peculiar personality. He never married and was rumored to have been romantically involved with only 2 men throughout his life. He was also a follower of a heretical religious sect and even prophesied that the apocalypse would occur in 2060. Despite this, Newton is revered as a great sage in textbooks and serves as an essential example for us to learn from. So, what kind of person was this role model really? Around 25 years ago, a professor at Oxford University delved into more than 150 cases of Newton's manuscripts and concluded that Newton was the last alchemist. At the age of 12, Newton's mother sent him to study at the King's School, where his signature can still be seen etched on a windowsill. While there, Newton lodged with a pharmacist whose daughter was quite beautiful and enjoyed reading books with Newton. As a result, Newton developed a love for reading. Newton had copied an entire book called The Mysteries of Nature and Art into a gold-bound notebook. The book contained various mechanical models, all of which Newton constructed. One of these inventions was a sundial, which has been preserved and remains intact to this day. Another was a kite lantern that frightened local residents when Newton flew it at night, as they mistook it for a comet, which at the time was considered a symbol of plague and disaster. When he was 15 years old, Newton encountered a bully in his class who wanted him to stay away from his sister. The bully cursed and insulted Newton, calling him an idiot. However, Newton, being the genius that he was, refused to tolerate such an insult. In response, he fought back and overpowered the bully, declaring not only that he would beat him, but also surpass him academically. And then things escalated quickly. Newton's academic performance soared, and he quickly became the top student in the school. At the age of 16, the headmaster believed that Newton was an excellent candidate for further studies at a university. However, when his mother heard about this, she was not pleased, concerned that attending university would mean neglecting their family's business. His family owned 24 hectares of ancestral fertile land, which ensuring that he was cared for by servants even after his father's death and his mother's remarriage. As a result, Newton had to obediently return home and inherit the family property. Fortunately, at this time, Newton's uncle intervened and eventually persuaded his mother to let Newton study at Cambridge. While at Cambridge, he met a fellow dormitory resident named Wilkins, with whom he later shared a home for 20 years. Together, Newton and Wilkins eagerly explored the laboratory building, only to find themselves baffled by the peculiar experiments being conducted at the time. These experiments included attempts to use garlic to demagnetize magnet, investigations into whether dried feces could treat cataract, and even experiments to determine if a mixture of guinea pig feces and salt could tame a rabid dog, among many others. With Newton's ordinary research topics, he couldn't even gain access to the laboratory. As a result, Newton and Wilkins retreated to their dormitory and decided to embark on an even more bizarre experiment. Newton documented in his notes that he covered his eyes with a feather and looked at the sun, observing a colorful halo. After a few hours, a massive sun remained in his vision, forcing him to lock himself in a dark room for 3 days before his sight returned to normal. Considering the sun-gazing experiment too dangerous, Newton sought a safer experimental method. He resorted to using a chisel to pierce his eye sockets and eyeballs, once again observing various white, black, and colorful halos. On one occasion, Newton and Wilkins visited a marketplace where they purchased a prism from a merchant. Finally, Newton conducted a more conventional experiment, which was the classic spectrophotometer experiment found in textbooks. However, the textbooks failed to mention that the merchant had also sold Newton several books on astrology. From these books, Newton gleaned a crucial insight. Mathematics was a powerful tool that could be used to unravel the truths of the universe. Upon graduation, Newton went to defend his thesis. His examiner was Professor Barrow, who found it peculiar that Newton had a weak grasp of Euclidean geometry, yet seemed incredibly proficient in the more advanced Cartesian geometry. Cartesian geometry is roughly equivalent to the analytic geometry found in our exams, emphasizing problem-solving through coordinate systems and mathematical calculations. In contrast, Euclidean geometry focuses on using laws and auxiliary lines to solve imaginative problems. Newton believed that imaginative ideas in Euclidean geometry had limited practical use, and saw the mathematical principles of Cartesian geometry as essential to unlocking the universe's truths. In his manuscript, he questioned why so many people were obsessed with solving basic Euclidean geometry problems just for self-satisfaction, especially considering that exams typically focused on this area. With this unconventional argument, could Newton successfully defend his thesis? Surprisingly, he did. Professor Barrow was an understanding educator who recognized Newton's perspective and reluctantly added his name to the list of graduates. Newton excitedly wrote in his notebook, "I want to use mathematics to explain astrology," which meant his graduate research would focus on astronomy. Unfortunately, just as graduate school began, the UK was struck by the Black Death, forcing the school to close. Newton had no choice but to return to his hometown to avoid the epidemic. It was during this time that the well-known textbook story of Newton being hit by an apple at his family home occurred, leading to his realization of universal gravitation and his subsequent rise to fame. However, in reality, Newton's path to greatness was far more winding. In 1667, after the plague epidemic ended, Newton returned to Cambridge to face his graduate entrance examination. He was concerned about securing a research position, as failing to do so would force him to return home and possibly abandon his scientific pursuits. Worried, Newton was then miraculously granted a research position, thanks to a series of unexpected events, including the dismissal of a senior researcher and the early retirement of 2 researchers due to alcohol-related injuries. Newton was overjoyed. Now he could finally continue his research without any concerns. And together with Likens, they enthusiastically went to the observatory. However, the situation at the observatory infuriated Newton. He asked, "Is this really your most advanced telescope? The lens is full of apertures, and you can't even see celestial bodies clearly. What are you even researching?" In his anger, Newton personally built a telescope without apertures, which was only a few centimeters long, but had a magnification of 40 times, making it more powerful than the 7 to 8 meters long telescopes of that time. One day, Professor Barrow happened upon Newton's telescope, and he was astonished. He inquired how Newton had devised such a design. Newton's concept was straightforward. By using a curved mirror to collect and focus light, instead of conventional lenses found in traditional refracting telescopes, chromatic aberration would be minimized. As a result, he unintentionally reduced the length of the telescope while simultaneously increasing its aperture and magnification. Today, almost all large telescopes use Newton's reflecting principle, and yet, this was just a small invention in Newton's own words. Newton had always been a private person. Despite Professor Barrow's repeated requests for him to publicly display his telescope, Newton kept refusing. He always believed his small invention wasn't good enough to be showcased. Finally, after 2 years of Barrow's persistent persuasion, Newton agreed to let him take the telescope to London for an exhibition at the Royal Society. As expected, Newton gained instant fame. In 1669, just 8 years after entering Cambridge, Newton succeeded Barrow and became the Lucasian professor. In the 300 years of the professorship, only 19 people have held the position. The previous famous Lucasian professor was Stephen Hawking, and so, with Barrow's unwavering support, Newton eventually decided to present something new to him. Newton shared a paper on optics titled Theory of Light and Color, while Barrow considered it to be one of the most experimentally driven papers of the Royal Society at that time. The journal back then was filled with articles on subjects like dissected hearts from animals, discussions on werewolves, 2-headed calves, and hermaphroditic creatures. However, after submitting the paper on light and color to the Royal Society, Newton inadvertently attracted a formidable adversary, Hooke. At the time, Hooke served as the director of experiments for the Royal Society and was a brilliant scientist in his own right. For instance, Hooke's law, the spring formula found in our textbooks, and the universal joint, known as the Hooke joint, are both attributed to him. Hooke also introduced the term cell in the field of biology after observing minuscule house-like structures through his homemade microscope. He meticulously documented his observations with exceptional illustrations, which even Newton greatly admired. Moreover, Hooke designed the most sophisticated and clear microscopes and telescopes of his time. However, Can you identify the issue? The problem seemingly originates from the telescope itself. Newton managed to surpass Hooke's carefully crafted masterpiece with a small device merely a few centimeters long. It's no surprise that when Newton's paper landed in Hooke's hands, he seized the opportunity to humiliate his rival. Hooke showed Newton's paper to everyone, claiming that Newton's experimental methods were not rigorous. He ridiculed Newton's assertion that light is a particle, claiming it was absurd. He pointed to various experiments, arguing that light should be considered a wave. Of course, Hooke wasn't merely talking nonsense. Today we know that light has both wave-particle duality, being both a particle and a wave. Hooke's attack on Newton was supported by many scientists at the time. Next, Hooke began to criticize Newton's telescope, accused Newton of blatant plagiarism, stating that 8 years prior, an English mathematician named James had published a paper with an identical telescope design. Newton received a deluge of letters, with various scholars criticizing Newton. This plunged the already insecure and lonely Newton into a deep abyss. At the age of 30, Newton's hair turned white almost overnight. Remarkably, this is a true story. The white hair seen in Newton's portraits is not a wig, but rather his actual hair color at the time. Newton once again retreated into seclusion, immersing himself in his bedroom and working with lichens to study forbidden alchemy. It seemed that only these otherworldly pursuits could bring him a sense of calm. In 1677, Barrow, the professor who had been supporting Newton, suddenly died. In the same year, a devastating fire broke out in Newton's laboratory, destroying more than a decade's worth of work. Newton, only 35 at the time, seemed to age another 10 years. In September, the secretary of the Royal Society, who had been smoothing things over for Newton, also passed away, and Hooke unexpectedly became the new secretary. A few months later, Newton's mother fell gravely ill. Newton rushed back home to treat her with medicine, but this only sustained her for 2 more years. In 1679, his mother also passed away. In that same year, Lichens, Newton's male companion of 20 years, left him without a word, and the reason remains unknown. Some researchers speculate that a severe emotional breakdown may have led to a fierce conflict between Newton and Lichens, but there is no concrete evidence to support this. All we know is that Lichens went on to become a pastor, got married, and had children. He never spoke of Newton again, and Newton never mentioned Lichens to anyone else. However, Hooke's mockery did not cease. Letter after letter continued to infiltrate Cambridge, and an exhausted Newton replied, "I hope not to be overly passionate about science in the future. Please do not blame me if you cannot see my subsequent research. I ask you all not to criticize my academic views and papers any further." Consequently, Hooke thoroughly defeated Newton, who then withdrew into his bedroom, never to appear again. Meanwhile, Newton began passionately conducting alchemical experiments in his laboratory, focusing on the transmutation of metals, the discovery of the philosopher's stone, and the elixir of life. Alchemical experiments were very dangerous and usually produced a lot of mercury vapor, which made people poisoned and then insane. It is when this time, Newton became more and more paranoid. He even wrote the prophecy himself. The end of the world may come later, but not earlier than 2060. After the end of the world, the Savior will come again. By 1693, everyone realized that Newton had gone mad. He raged at his friends in his letters, and his thoughts became contradictory. Later, scholars analyzed Newton's hair and discovered significant mercury poisoning. Theoretically, this should have inflicted severe damage to his brain, rendering Newton incapacitated. Yet, against all odds, a miraculous turn of events took place. Struggling in madness for only 4 months, Newton unexpectedly declared his departure from Cambridge, his secluded haven for over 30 years. He abandoned his reclusive lifestyle and sought employment at the Royal Mint, expressing a desire to serve the public as a civil servant. This sudden transformation caught everyone off guard, but Newton continued to showcase his remarkable abilities. For instance, if you examine a coin today, you'll notice a circular pattern around its edge, regardless of the coin's denomination. This innovation is credited to Newton during his tenure at the Mint. At the time, counterfeiters known as clippers would shave the edges of official coins, melt the shavings, and cast them into new currency. Newton effectively thwarted this practice with his invention. Consequently, the nation had to recall and remint over 7 million old coins. Given the mint's efficiency at the time, this process would have taken at least 30 years, an insurmountable task. However, Newton rose to the challenge, reforming the coin-making machinery, streamlining the minting process, and authoring thousands of pages on machinery and organizational management. Ultimately, he accomplished the work that would have taken 30 years in just 2.5 years. Newton was then promoted to director of the mint and knighted by the Queen, emerging as a prominent political figure. Newton's grand scheme for revenge gradually unfolded. First, he used his political influence to intentionally undermine the Royal Society, which was still under Hooke's leadership. As anticipated, by 1703, Hooke had passed away, and the Royal Society teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. Newton then orchestrated a group of scientists to invite him to assume the role of the new president. He subsequently revitalized the Royal Society and proposed relocating it to the more opulent Crane Court. During the move, however, all of Hooke's statues and portraits were lost. The existing portraits of Hooke were created by later generations, relying on memory. In 1704, 7 years after Hooke's death, Newton published his second major work, Optics. This groundbreaking book compiled his research on optics, a subject that had exposed him to Hooke's criticism more than 30 years earlier. The concluding chapter of this story takes us to 1727, when one morning an 85-year-old Newton suddenly resolved to burn some of his seemingly irrelevant manuscripts. A few weeks later, he slipped into a coma and passed away on March 30th. It is speculated that Newton burned his lifelong belief in the mechanical universe theory, which suggests that a true God designed everything in the universe and then concealed itself. Newton's scientific, theological, and alchemical research aimed to uncover this true God. Some claim he was successful and discovered the answer within the manuscripts he burned.